Death toll mounts in the escalating violence. 250,000 people have now died from coronavirus in India. The federal government secures 25 million doses of the Moderna vaccine. And the Buddhist ritual of releasing animals causing environmental headaches for Hong Kong authorities. You're watching The World. Also tonight, why coronavirus patients in India are developing the deadly black fungus infection. Let's though go straight to the Israeli side of the border with Gaza, where we're showing you some live pictures. A short time ago, Israeli troops were seen massing in the area. A military spokesman says combat troops are preparing in various stages for possible ground operations in Gaza as attacks between Hamas militants and the Israeli forces continue raging. Such a move, though, would replicate similar incursions during the Israel-Gaza wars in 2014 and 2008. And it's been another bloody and violent 24 hours in Gaza. The death toll since the violence escalated this week has now risen to 67. Both sides showing no signs of backing down. Here's Middle East correspondent Tom Joyner, who's at Ashkelon in Israel.
On these chaotic streets, no one is safe. This man, identified as an Arab, is dragged from his car and beaten by a racist mob of Israelis in the Tel Aviv suburbs. He's then left bleeding on the ground. Grief is spilling out onto the streets. This Palestinian mother is burying her 16-year-old son today.
It's hard for me. My children are my life.
Shot dead by Israeli forces, the boy leaves behind 3 siblings and a community on edge. This building is on the busiest shopping street in Gaza. Hit by Israeli airstrikes, the high-rise housed Hamas's television channel. Another Israeli airstrike killed 16 members of the organisation, including its leader, Bassem Issa. The group has vowed thousands of its supporters will follow in their footsteps, while Israeli forces confirmed a ground invasion could follow the bombardment from the air. Soon after, rockets fired from Gaza reached deep into Israel.
This is something we cannot accept. It's anarchy.
Just as deadly attacks have been exchanged, so have words of warning.
I address my words specifically to America and to Israel. Enough is enough. Leave us alone. We will remain like a thorn in your eyes. We will not leave our country.
Here in Ashkelon, rockets from the Gaza Strip barraged the beach city following the attacks on Hamas officials.
Locals here are getting used to these sorts of sights, but tensions in the region is causing alarm across the world, with leaders weighing in on the conflict. US President Joe Biden spoke to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, expressing optimism that the fighting would come to an imminent end. Tom Joyner, ABC News, Ashkelon.
And we'll have more on those tensions with analyst Yossi Meckelberg a little later. Well, India has passed another sobering pandemic milestone. The ravaged nation has just hit 250,000 deaths. That was after adding 4,100 over the past 24 hours. New infections are still sitting at around 350,000 a day, and there is no sign of the situation improving. Experts still believe the official numbers are grossly underestimating the scale of the crisis and that actual deaths and infections could be 5 to 10 times higher. Our South Asia correspondent James Oaten is in Delhi.
Gasping for air, Dr. Dimple Aurora Chavla recorded a warning.
Please don't take corona so lightly.
The young mother, who was 7 months pregnant, had tested positive for COVID 6 days earlier.
Please wear mask whenever you go outside, and especially during my pregnancy. I really don't want.
Just over a week later, Dr. Chavla lost her unborn baby. The next day, she also died.
Her untimely demise led me to post this message to the world so that the world can know that, you should not take COVID so lightly.
The number of deaths in India remains staggeringly high. The true figure will never be known. Countless people have died whose identity or cause of death will never be officially recorded. With many major cities overwhelmed, the virus is now ravaging the poorest and most remote. Health services here were never prepared for the onslaught. It's a black hole for reliable data.
I told the staff that my mum's oxygen cylinder is empty. She's shivering in pain. They're doing nothing.
India is made up of a patchwork of local restrictions and state lockdowns. These are often announced or extended at the last minute and only for a week or two. The question is, when will India decide to open up? Because right now, the virus is still very much in control.
Our positivity rate is around 20%, which shows that we are testing very low. And when we are testing very low, this means we are missing lots of patients.
Restricting the surge in uncertain times. James Oaten, ABC News, Delhi.
Sri Lanka is imposing a 3-day nationwide lockdown as the country reports a daily record 2,200 new cases. Authorities have introduced movement restrictions limiting the reasons and times people are allowed out. The total number of active cases in the country is the highest it's been since the pandemic began. The island nation is suffering from restricted supply of vaccines due to the crisis in neighbouring India. And the Australian government says it will provide assistance to Fiji as the country deals with a growing outbreak there. 2 major cities, including the capital Suva, will go into hard lockdown tomorrow night as case numbers rise due to a quarantine breach last month, which involved travellers from India. Australia sent 10,000 vaccines to Fiji last week and is likely to send the same amount within days to assist with the outbreak.
People are frightened. There have been very many days of panic as people went about stocking up, trying to stay indoors for those who are adhering to the COVID-19 protocols and guidelines. But there's a lot of imagery coming out in India because of what you've rightly stated, our historical links with the country. And given that a lot of Fijian nationals travel to India as a first choice for medical treatment, so there's a lot of anxiety in the country. There's a lot of worry given that the B1617 variant tends to be highly infectious and is moving quite fast through the community.
Another 25 million COVID vaccine doses are on order for Australia, adding to the supplies of AstraZeneca and Pfizer. The 2-dose Moderna vaccine, which is similar to the Pfizer jab, will start arriving later in the year, with the bulk to come next year. It's a much-needed boost for the very sluggish national rollout. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
I'm very happy that I'm going to get my Moderna shot today.
A jab with star power.
Vaccine, 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 vaccine.
Dolly Parton's put money and her mouth behind Moderna, a vaccine already approved in the United States, European Union, Britain, Canada and Singapore. 25 million Moderna doses now on Australian order, 10 million to arrive by year's end.
So today is the next stage of future-proofing.
Like the Pfizer shot, Moderna is an mRNA vaccine, a new generation jab.
It's a highly effective vaccine in clinical trials and likely to be very effective at preventing transmissions.
It's also a candidate for local manufacture. Adelaide biotech firm Biosina saying the purpose-built plant it bought from Pfizer could produce an mRNA vaccine within 12 months.
We can have the ability to manufacture 150 million doses, and that would serve the region rather than just Australia. So there's an export opportunity as well.
Although the government's immediate concern will be to settle nagging doubts about the vaccine rollout.
This locks in our capacity to ensure that every Australian has access to a vaccine this year.
Why do Australians have to wait to the end of this year? What happened to Scott Morrison's promise that Australians were at the front of the vaccine queue?
The Moderna contract comes at a very handy time for the government. Tuesday's budget assumed a population-wide vaccination program being in place by year's end, but ministers have offered varying interpretations as to what that means. The Moderna deal injects a sense of momentum into the rollout.
Phil, was it right?
And as every politician will tell you,
job as chair of a parliamentary committee,
a lack of momentum can be dangerous.
He just fell over.
Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
Yes, he did. Federal opposition leader Anthony Albanese has vowed to spend $10 billion on social and affordable housing if he wins the next election. In his annual budget reply speech tonight, Mr Albanese promised women and children fleeing domestic violence will be big beneficiaries of the program.
You excited about tonight? Yeah, no, it'll be good.
Labor's economic team got themselves caffeinated in a courtyard in preparation for the biggest day on an opposition's calendar.
It's an opportunity for us to talk about the issues that matter.
The budget reply is one of the few moments they're the centre of attention. And with an election on the horizon, Anthony Albanese is using it to sell a series of proposals.
What wins an election is a determination to present a vision for the country.
He's dusting off an old policy to encourage young people to set up companies, is vowing to crack down on wage theft and is promising to splash cash on renewable energy apprenticeships.
The rest of the world has figured this out. Cutting pollution means creating jobs.
Yeah. But the centrepiece of tonight's speech is social housing. If elected, the opposition is vowing to set up the Housing Australia Future Fund. $10 billion will be allocated to it. In the first 5 years, it'll build about 20,000 new apartments. 4,000 of those will be allocated to women and children fleeing domestic violence. It's an issue the Labor leader's been passionate about his entire life. He grew up in social housing and has shared the story of his childhood many times.
Our home gave us so much more than somewhere to sleep. It gave my mum and I pride and dignity and security. And it gave me a future that led me here tonight.
Tonight's a significant moment for Anthony Albanese. The pandemic has made it hard for oppositions around the country to get much airtime, and the government's just encroached on Labor's traditional territory with its big spending budget.
We can do better than that, and we will.
He has to. Failure to get his party's message out will infuriate his colleagues and could consign them to another 3 years in opposition. James Glenday, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, let's return to our top story, and that is Israel, where there's been renewed waves of street violence as Israel and Hamas continue to exchange fire in the worst hostility seen in years. Senior Consulting Research Fellow for Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program, Professor Yossi Meckelberg, is with us from London. Yossi, great to talk to you. These tensions are always just below the surface, but why have they erupted now?
Hello. Because the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular, it's a battle of explosive, always one match away from exploding. Now, unfortunately, a combination of events in recent week amounted to this match that put the fire on. Whether it's the eviction of Palestinian Sheikh Jarrah, not allowing Palestinians to participate in the Palestinian election, the heavy-handed of the Israeli police during the Ramadan month. So you have a culmination with the rise of the far right in Israel that feel more confident to provoke. Having said that, also the breakdown in the Palestinian in the Palestinian political system and in the instability in Israel, all are contributing factors in what we see right now.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. We know that Israel's had 4 elections. There's still no conclusive result. How is that political uncertainty paying into this at the moment?
What happens, Israel has too many elections without a result, and the Palestinians don't have enough election because they haven't held one for 15 years. And both of them create a legitimacy or democratic deficit in this sense. I don't think what we see now is because there is no government as such. I think what we see is the result of neglect of the government for many years. At the end of the day, the sides need to sit to the negotiation table and find once and for all a fair and just solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The occupation, the blockade in Gaza is all unacceptable. What the Hamas is doing with firing rockets is something that should be condemned. But Israel needs to think to itself, why is the Hamas actually been elected in the first place 15 years ago? Why is the radicalization among the Palestinians? And in this, Israel contribute to this. And part of it, the political instability in Israel, radicalize and push to the right the debate, the discourse within Israel.
We know that during the Trump years, Israel was emboldened to a degree. Now with the new Biden administration, and we know that Joe Biden spoke to Benjamin Netanyahu overnight, might that change the dynamic and help find a way, this path forward that might bring both sides to the table?
As much as I would like to forget the Trump years and the horrendous legacy of the Trump years on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as in other areas, the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, defunding the Palestinians and UNRWA and expelling the Palestinian delegation from Washington, all of this caused real rift and create more hopelessness among the Palestinians. Now, some of the things very difficult for the Biden administration to change, like the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem. Some, they actually try to create change, like funding again UNRWA and some of the Palestinian institutions. The problem, I'm not so sure that the Middle East and Israel-Palestine is high on the agenda in Washington, considering the pandemic and China and Russia and the division within the United States. It's low priority in Washington. However, Biden was a very experienced politician, of course. We learn or relearn that the Middle East always, at the end of the day, sucks you into it. And this is kind of an early welcome by the Israel and Palestinians. What happens if there is not enough attention by international community?
Indeed. I might just like to ask you, finally, that we see troops, Israeli troops amassing on the border just near Gaza. If there was a ground offensive, which hasn't happened in some years, how provocative would that be to the very tense situation at the moment?
Heaven saves us. We know that if you look at Gaza, it's a tiny, tiny territory with more than 2 million people. It means that any fighting ground troops is almost door to door. The result is huge amount of casualties. We saw it in 2008 and 2009, and in 2014, another occasion. I assume, but I'm not so sure about it, it's more deterrence, the Hamas, to say, if you continue firing into the heart of Israel and dense population, this is an option. But let's hope it never happens and ceasefire will be declared before long.
Yossi, appreciate you joining us. Many thanks.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Well, a man has been charged with multiple counts of murder over a mass shooting at a school in Russia. 9 people were killed in the attack this week, making it Russia's deadliest school shooting since 2018. The 19-year-old suspect is a former pupil of the school. The court ordered him to be held in custody for 2 months pending trial. Well, I think we can all agree that we've had to rely on the hard work and care of nurses to get us through the COVID-19 pandemic. International Nurses Day commemorates the birth of Florence Nightingale, the mother of nursing. And on this occasion, nurses from around the world are calling to be looked after too. Here's Talia Olatia.
In Pakistan, nurse Huma Kamal signs in for another busy day in her hospital's COVID-19 intensive care unit.
I feel happy when patients recover from COVID-19, but when the patient dies in hospital, I feel really disheartened. Being a nurse is a burden on me and I feel trauma. We have witnessed large numbers of deaths during the pandemic.
Her work is relentless, and with the country in their 3rd wave of the virus, it shows no signs of slowing down. Spain, on the other hand, is beginning to open back up. And to say thank you on International Nurses Day, nurses in Madrid were treated to a classical music performance.
They have given us a big present with a musical quartet. But the present we nurses would like the best is for young people to use protective measures. This pandemic is not over.
Meanwhile, in Argentina, 183 nurses have died from COVID-19. Nurses marked the day by marching for improved work conditions and better pay.
It is unfair that a nurse has to die with not enough personal protection equipment and that politicians are all vaccinated. Those of us on the front line have to drop like flies.
In France, nurses also went from the front line to the picket line.
We need caregivers because patients need more and more specific care. We've been self-sufficient for a year now. Our vacations have been cancelled and we're reaching our limits.
In the UK, during the height of the pandemic, every Thursday at 8 p.m, people would clap for carers. But this year, the government has only recommended a 1% pay rise for NHS staff in England.
My relative, Florence Nightingale, she'd be roaring today.
The carers need to be cared for too. Talia Olatia, ABC News.
Nearly 3,000 inmates at 2 prisons in Thailand have tested positive for COVID-19 as the country battles a new wave of infections. The outbreaks are at the Bangkok Special Prison, which holds detainees ahead of trial, and the Central Women's Correctional Institution. Thailand's new coronavirus wave began at the beginning of April and accounts for more than 3/4 of all COVID-19 deaths in the country. Many cases involve the more infectious British variant of the virus. There's also concern over low vaccine supplies, with only 3% of Thailand's population being inoculated so far. As expected, the US Republican Party has ejected prominent Trump critic Liz Cheney from her leadership position in the House of Representatives. Her abrupt removal as the third-ranking House Republican took place at a closed-door meeting. Her likely replacement is a Trump loyalist, a clear sign that the former president continues to wield significant power over the party. Ms. Cheney was one of 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump for his role in inciting an insurrection on the Capitol.
I will not sit back and watch in silence while others lead our party down a path that abandons the rule of law and joins the former president's crusade to undermine our democracy.
Ms. Cheney will seek re-election next year and has vowed to do everything in her power to stop Donald Trump ever returning to the White House. Well, doctors in India have warned that even if their patients survive a COVID infection, a portion are going on to develop serious and sometimes fatal infections of black fungus. It's called mucormycosis, and while it's normally fairly rare, hospitals are reporting a spike in cases as India grapples with its devastating second wave. I'm joined by ear, nose and throat surgeon Dr. Manish Munjal from India. Now, Dr. Munjal, many thanks for your time. Firstly, can you tell us what is mucormycosis?
In intensive care units in hospitals all around the world. What happens is that when your body is in an immunocompromised state because of some chemotherapy or due to some disease or due to induced suppression by drugs such as steroids, just like the ones used extensively in treating COVID patients to reduce their inflammatory response, what happens is that the opportunistic infections, as we all call them, they gain entry into our bodies through our passages, like our mouth and also our nose. So in these cases, what happens is that one of the deadliest ones is fungal infection. And there is a species known as the Rhizopus species, as many plant botanists know it. If you have seen a sugarcane stem, and you've seen a blackening at the base of it, that's exactly the friendly species, the brother species of the same fungus. But when it invades a human body, it would go through these defenses and then causes a widespread destruction of tissues because it goes through the bloodstream really fast and also through the nerves. And normally in these cases, there is a blackening of those areas where it goes, like, for example, it goes from the mouth or the nose. You'll start seeing a black kind of a scab around these areas, maybe sometimes very painful or sometimes without pain at all. And then very rapidly, it can go into the eye, cause damage to the eyeball. And if it goes to the brain, then it is a fatal disease.
Yeah.
So more, yeah.
And so why do you think, I mean, is it the fact that COVID patients are so in such a weakened state, their immune systems are so weakened that they've been susceptible to this?
So there is a myth and there is a fact about it. If you have a mild COVID infection anywhere around the world, you don't need to worry because you haven't taken any immunosuppression. In fact, your body had sufficient immunity and it could fight on its own. At the most, you needed a paracetamol or things like that, a vitamin, that's all. But if you had to take steroids to suppress the immune response of your body, that immune system itself, the weakening that you caused due to the steroid, will invite other infections. And because in India especially, why would you say, we are a pre-diabetic population. There's a lot of diabetes in India. The sugar levels coupled with the steroids induce an extra immune suppression more than anywhere seen around the world. And that is causing this much higher rate in India.
So when we're watching, you know, the images coming out of India, the hospitals like the one you're working in, you're under so much pressure. Is it that it is sometimes hard to quickly identify this and this is becoming quite a fatal consequence for many COVID patients?
Yes, especially so because the COVID centers at hospitals are no entry zones for anybody. And suddenly you have to open up suddenly a new window for the negative patients who have recovered from COVID. The family is financially, emotionally, physically ruined. And then suddenly they are put into a situation where they have to prepare for another disease. How bad it could be than this. And on top of that, you have to open up the operating rooms, the other areas of the hospital, re-guide your entire staff and doctors and who are fighting the COVID. All of them are tired horses, and now they have to deal with this devastating infection. Thankfully, it is not in the same frequency as the COVID infection. The cases are far and few, like 1 in 1,000 maybe, and I don't have a data to support, but we are trying to bring about a consensus amongst various hospitals around. But the disease is so dangerous that, you know, it brings about a lot of fear in everybody. That's the problem.
And Dr. Munjal, what about the longer-term consequences? Even if a patient is able to recover, what can the longer-term effect be?
So even in this case, the earliest detection, if it is done, you could escape without a problem. At the most, you would need an IV antifungal, which is called amphotericin B. And with that institution, if you do well, in a few days' time, you could go home with just the medication in the earliest few cases. But sadly, that's not usually the case. People are coming here with damaged eye, visions, and sometimes even cosmetic eschars on their cheeks, and they have to undergo mutilating surgery. So even if they survive, you're left in the long run, a young person at times without one-sided eye or a palate which is not functional, and sometimes a long-term period of a lot of medications, further dressings and hospital visits and things like that. Not to talk about a sudden case of death also, which is frequently occurring in one of these cases. So it's a little bit scary, definitely.
Certainly, and adding to the strain you're under. And we do appreciate you taking time out. I know you are under enormous pressure at the moment. Thanks so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, a piece by street artist and activist Banksy has fetched more than $16 million at auction, and the winning bidder is paying with cryptocurrency. According to Sotheby's, it's the first time a major auction house has accepted the digital currency as payment for a physical piece of art. The protest image titled "Love is in the Air" was sold after a 14-minute bidding war with 4 participants.
3, 2, 1, and the hammer is lowering now at $11 million with Jackie. Sold. Thank you very much indeed.
The auction also marked the return of in-person bidding, with a limited number of collectors allowed to attend the New York sales room for the first time in more than a year. And in New York, a 1983 painting by late American artist Jean-Michel Basquiat has sold for $119 million, almost twice what it was expected to fetch. Industry figures say with the exception of Basquiat, African-American painters have long been undervalued by collectors and underrepresented in museums. Well, to what in the world, and pangolins have been getting a bad rap lately because, of course, they're the natural hosts of coronavirus. But at the same time, they're constantly under threat from smugglers who target them for their meat and scales. So when Indian authorities recovered a pangolin from a smuggler who tested positive for coronavirus, well, the animal had to get tested as well. Forest officials were filmed struggling to collect a nose swab from this rather unhappy target, squirming and trying to roll himself up into a ball. The swab was eventually collected and the animal will remain in quarantine until it's examined again prior to being released. Poor thing. And you're watching The World. Our top stories tonight. Israeli troops are massing at Gaza's border to prepare for possible ground operations as violence between Israel's security forces and Palestinian militants escalate. India's COVID-19 deaths have passed 250,000 on the deadliest day of the pandemic, but it is estimated that it is far higher. And Australia buys 25 million doses of the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine, with 10 million expected to be delivered this year. Well, now, time for Behind the Wall with Stan Grant.
Hello, welcome to Behind the Wall. I'm Stan Grant. It was Budget Week in Canberra, an opportunity for the government to outline its agenda for the year ahead. But relations with our biggest trading partner are at a low not seen for some time, a fact which has the potential to impact our recovery from the coronavirus recession. James Lawrenceson is the director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, and he joins me now. James, good to have you with us. I want to look at the budget and, of course, the name that was not mentioned, and that is China. Is it extraordinary to you that we can set out our budget forecast, we can talk about returning to economic growth and emerging from recession and not mention our biggest trading partner?
What was extraordinary to me, Stan, was, as you said, China by name was not mentioned, but its impact was plainly evident. I mean, the budget received a $20 billion boost because of Chinese demand for Australian iron ore. To put that in perspective, that is 5 times the increase in the defence budget over the past year. So this gets at the complexity too, because this idea that less trade with China and will somehow make us safe is plainly wrong. That trade not only funds health, education and so on, but it even funds defence as well.
And let me just flip that, James, because you're right. While China wasn't mentioned by name, there was an inference. And the other inference was that China is making the world more dangerous and our world more uncertain. Given the hold that China has over our economy as our biggest trading partner, given how important it is to our export markets, and given how many jobs rely on exports, does that then not conversely give China an enormous power over us that it can use against us?
That's the common view, Stan. And look, it's not entirely incorrect, but here's another interesting thing in the budget papers and in the economic data is over the last year, despite the monumental political dispute that Australia and China are having, our total exports to China actually fell by less than 1%. To all other countries, they fell by more than 5%. Now, that's because there's some strong economic factors that are underpinning the Australia-China relationship, and in particular, China wants and needs our iron ore. So look, yes, there are some goods where China can substitute away from Australian products, and lobster fishers and wine growers know all about that. Their pain is real. But at least at the macroeconomic level, things continue to hold up because of iron ore.
And that's interesting, James. Does that then suggest to you that the fundamentals of this trade relationship overwhelmingly can survive what we see as this new Cold War, the heated rhetoric, the drums of war references that we're hearing so much more of now?
It does get at an extraordinary complementarity between the Australian and Chinese economies, Stan, but I think we are at the point now where we have to recognise that the pain is real as well. As I said, the totals may be holding it up, but if you're a lobster fisher or a wine grower, then your bank balance is hurting badly now. Your employees are suffering and those local communities are suffering too. So essentially what's happening is that some parts of the country, some pockets of the country are taking one for the team. And I'm not so sure they're being supported very well by Canberra right at this moment.
James, we talk a lot about China, but of course China alone is not just changing the geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape. There are other countries as well. I looked recently at what the IMF identifies as the 5 countries that contribute to half of all global growth. And they include China and Brazil and Indonesia and India and Russia. Not countries I would say that immediately spring to mind in Australia, and not countries we hear talked about a lot when it comes to the economy. Are we seeing a fundamental shift in the world where these previously emerging economies are now gathering more strength, and that's going to flow through to things like not just international trade, but international diplomacy, geostrategic and geopolitics as well?
Stan, the facts and evidence say we are experiencing a fundamental shift, and I think the statistics on global growth that you just cited make that point very convincingly. Unfortunately, what I worry about is in Australia, we still are yet to admit that. In fact, when we talk about our foreign policy these days and responding to China, the countries we immediately reach out to try and grasp for are our Five Eyes Anglophone friends, the US, the UK, New Zealand and Canada. But Stan, you and I know that's not where growth in the world economy is coming from now. And with economic power comes strategic weight as well.
James, given the heated rhetoric that we're seeing, and given this increasing tension with China, and not just all one way, of course, because we know that China also has been much more aggressive, assertive, even belligerent in recent years, does that make it more difficult for people like yourself who like to approach this with perhaps a more nuanced perspective, try to inject some balance, try to look at both sides of the ledger? Do you feel it is more difficult to prosecute that case when we are in a new sort of Cold War environment, if you like?
Stan, I'm a boring academic, but here's what's happened to me over the last 6 months. I've had death threats levelled at me. I've had defamation threats. I've had pressure campaigns, social media campaigns attacking my peer-reviewed academic publications, pressuring publishers to remove them. So this is an extraordinary environment we're in. And I think it comes from the language at the top. Scott Morrison says that on foreign policy, we must speak with one voice. We now have new laws that allows the foreign minister to define the national interest and the foreign policy that's consistent with that, and tear up any agreements between universities and state governments and foreign countries that she doesn't agree with. In other words, there's now in Australia a correct line on China. Now that sounds an awful lot like the Chinese Communist Party's approach to me, but what it does mean is when someone like myself or you voice some views that are different to the correct line, then now you can be accused of being a traitor and selling out to your country. That's the McCarthyist environment we're now in.
When you talk about those threats, where are they coming from, James?
Some are anonymous emails that are showing up. Some of them, I mean, I can't really get into the legal matters, but they're actually well known. They're not just affecting me, by the way. They're affecting a number of civic society members too. And, you know, it is somewhat ironic because we do worry, rightly, about the Chinese Communist Party cutting the scope for free speech in this country. But what we're seeing now is threats to freedom of speech coming from the Chinese Communist Party's fiercest critics. I'll leave you to ponder what that means.
Just finally, does that then change the way that you approach this? Do you check your words? Do you self-censor? Do you think what impact this is going to have, given some of the response that you're receiving right now?
Yeah, all of the above, Stan. So I'm not someone who wants to run and hide in a corner. I see these threats to freedom of speech, whether they're coming from the Chinese Communist Party or its fiercest critics, as bullying threats. So no, I'm not inclined to back down, but it certainly makes every day a pretty tough slog.
Well, a pleasure to have you on the program and sharing your very forthright and honest views with us today, James. Appreciate it. Thank you again.
Cheers, Stan.
Well, lines of panicked drivers have overwhelmed petrol stations across the US southeast after a cyber attack forced the nation's largest fuel pipeline to shut down. The outage triggered fuel shortages and panic buying. In North Carolina, 2 customers resorted to physical violence to force their way to the front of the queue. And in Atlanta, nearly 60% of petrol stations ran out of fuel.
You know, I'm not even panic buying. I've just been getting a little low for the last couple days, and then all this starts going on, and it's like the toilet paper fiasco all over again.
The Colonial Pipeline has now been restarted, but it'll take days to get back to normal. Well, vaccinations are being rolled out at subway stations in New York. 6 sites have been set up in transportation hubs, including Grand Central Station. Until Sunday, people will receive a free 7-day Metro card if they get their vaccine at one of the locations. Authorities say more than 300 shots were administered during morning rush hour yesterday at Grand Central alone. Well, more than 2 million people in the Perth and Peel regions will be allowed to return to pre-lockdown life from Saturday after no new COVID cases were uncovered in the community. Masks will no longer be mandatory on public transport or at major events, and there'll be no limit on numbers for weddings, funerals and home gatherings, while visitor numbers for patients in hospital, aged care and disability facilities can return to normal.
The return to pre-lockdown life is only possible because of the collective effort of all West Australians.
A capacity crowd will be allowed at Perth Stadium when the Eagles play Adelaide this weekend. Hong Kong Buddhists are preparing to release hundreds of thousands of animals in a ritual called mercy release. But experts say the practice does more harm than good, as released animals often die and can also pose a risk to the local environment. Stevie Zhang has more.
Between now and next Wednesday, thousands of turtles will be released into Hong Kong's waterways to celebrate Buddha's birthday. For Buddhists here, the turtles not only symbolize longevity, but the freeing of animals in these mercy releases will bring releasers good fortune. The same ritual ensues yearly. Some choose to release frogs, others baby birds, fish, even monkeys. But experts say these animals are often intentionally captured and sold just for this ritual. And they often do not survive long in their newfound freedom.
If they used to be cared for by humans, they won't be able to hunt in the wild. They may not be able to catch the fish, shrimp or food they need, then they'll starve to death. Or due to the change in weather, they might freeze to death or die from the heat.
Sean Lai runs the Hong Kong Abandoned Tortoise Concern Group. He says his volunteers have been nursing more than 60 injured turtles in recent months.
We treat them accordingly, such as broken shells and skin infections. We nurture them back to health and allow people to adopt them after they become healthy again and gain weight.
While not illegal, these mercy releases can have far-reaching consequences.
Ecosystems that are receiving non-native animals can be changed by the arrival of those animals if they manage to survive. It could totally alter the structure of our forests or our streams or our rivers, because those animals come in and start to shape things differently.
These red-eared sliders are commonly dumped in the city's waterways, but they originate from the United States.
Potential disease, bacteria, virus, parasites from other countries, from the collection source, are all getting dumped without screening or without sort of consideration of the public health risk as well.
The Hong Kong Buddhist Association says it does not condone releasing animals and recommends alternatives to helping animals, like becoming vegetarian. Stevie Zhang, ABC News.
Australian Muslims have gathered to mark the end of Ramadan. Eid al-Fitr is one of the most important events on the Islamic calendar, but for many Muslim Palestinians, today's celebration was tinged with sadness as they watch the ongoing conflict back home.
After celebrating Eid in isolation last year, there was no stopping Muslims coming together today. Thousands of worshippers flocked to mosques this morning to mark the beginning of Eid al-Fitr.
Very beautiful day for the Muslims today.
The congregation so big, prayers spilled out onto the street, some even gathering in parks. After the prayers came the feasting, and there was plenty of food for everyone.
We're really enjoying a lot, enjoying the food after fasting for a whole month.
The old and the young sharing in the joy of the 3-day festival.
I really enjoy Eid, and you get a lot of money, so that's the most exciting thing for kids.
The first of many Eids for this 2-month-old.
She didn't let us sleep, so we're already excited as it is. I think she was excited with us as well.
But some found it difficult to celebrate. The escalating violence back home in Gaza was front of mind for Muslim Palestinians.
We try to celebrate the Eid, but our heart is bleeding about what's happening in Palestine back there.
We are mourning the lives that have been killed, but it's also an Eid where we remind ourselves of the resistance and the strength of our people.
Resilience during the toughest of times. Lydia Feng, ABC News, Sydney.
Ellen DeGeneres will end her Emmy-winning daytime talk show next year, her 19th season, saying it no longer is a challenge for her. The 63-year-old will discuss the decision on tomorrow's show with guest Oprah Winfrey. Last year, the show was embroiled in controversy after 3 producers left after allegations of a toxic workplace, for which DeGeneres apologised. A family-friendly drag show at the Ipswich Bowls Club is breaking down barriers and changing attitudes, one glitter costume at a time. Once a month, a group of queens, including Queensland's youngest drag queen, take over the Bowls Club and strut their stuff to sold-out audiences of all ages.
Makeup ready and high heels on, Logan Kelly transforms into Candy Featherbottom.
Candy is literally just another human in me, I could call it. She definitely feels energetic. Excited is a big one.
At 13 years old, he is Queensland's youngest drag queen.
It was just a spark that flew in me.
Logan made his drag debut at just 10 years old at the North Ipswich Bowls Club, which doubles as a family-friendly drag club called Taboo.
I was only giving it to around 2 years, 2 to 3 years max. I'm thinking, if I can get there, I've achieved something. But 10 years later, we're going absolutely strong.
Once a month, the Queens perform to sold-out audiences, not only entertaining crowds, but changing attitudes towards the art.
They can come to a place like this and feel accepted for who they are.
We're in this day and age where being a drag queen doesn't matter.
Logan's mother says he was born to strut the stage, but admits she sometimes worries about people's preconceived ideas of what being a drag queen is.
So at the end of the day, if it's something that your child loves doing, it's in a safe environment, and, why not?
The club attracted the attention of a Brisbane-based filmmaker who made a documentary on the personal lives of the drag queens, which aired on SBS earlier this year. The director says there are now plans to turn the story of Australia's youngest drag queen and the North Ipswich Bowls Club into a full-length feature film.
We're hoping that I can play me in the movie, so that's why Candy and Logan actually might work very well together in the future.
Rachel McGee, ABC News, Ipswich.
Well, Hobart looks certain to host its first test match since 2016, when Australia hosts Afghanistan at Balreeve in late November. The test will mark the first time Australia has played Afghanistan in the longest format of the game and will signal the start of the men's international season. If selected, it will mean current Test skipper Tim Payne will play his first test at his home ground. Tasmania's last test match was between Australia and South Africa in 2016. The clash with Afghanistan will be a one-off match and will lead into the home Ashes series. An official announcement is expected next week. And Brisbane will be the epicentre of the